I thought my life was over the day my granddaughter took me from my home without a single word. But I never imagined that betrayal would lead me to a place more beautiful than anything I had ever known, and to a secret inheritance that would change everything. I still remember the sound of the waves that morning. They weren't particularly loud, but there was a steady rhythm to them, almost like the ticking of an old grandfather clock. I'd been sitting in my usual spot, the armchair by the front bay window, sipping my morning tea. The sun was trying to break through the gray clouds, casting thin streaks of light over the rooftops and down onto the Brighton pier. The seagulls were already busy, swooping down in chaotic lines, their squawks mixing with the distant hum of the city waking up. It was the kind of day you'd call ordinary, if you didn't know what was coming. I'd lived in that little terraced house for more than 40 years. It wasn't grand, just 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a living room that always smelled faintly of wood polish and tea leaves. But it was mine. Every corner had a memory. The worn patch on the carpet by the fireplace was where my late wife, Margaret, used to rest her feet in the evenings. The slightly leaning bookcase in the corner had been a weekend project I started in 1978 and never quite finished properly. Life had been slower these last few years. I wasn't as quick on my feet as I used to be, and sometimes the kettle felt heavier in my hand, but I was still independent. I still went for walks down to the promenade, still greeted the shopkeepers by name, and still enjoyed the quiet comfort of living in a place where everything from the sound of the buses to the salty air was familiar. That's why I didn't think much of it when Emily, my granddaughter, called the night before and said she'd be stopping by for a chat. She hadn't visited in a few weeks, and I missed her company. Emily was the last close family I had left. Margaret had been gone for 15 years now, and my only son, Peter, had passed away far too young. Emily had been my little shadow when she was a girl, following me into the garden, asking me endless questions about flowers and insects, and laughing at my terrible jokes. So, when I heard the knock at the door that morning, I felt nothing but warmth. I opened it to find Emily standing there, her blonde hair pulled back into a ponytail, a knitted scarf around her neck, even though the air was only mildly chilly. But it wasn't her appearance that struck me. It was her eyes. Normally, they sparkled with mischief or kindness, but that morning, there was something else in them, a sort of stillness. "Morning, Grandpa," she said, leaning in for a hug. "Morning, love," I replied, pulling her close. She smelled faintly of lavender shampoo. "You're up early. Want a cuppa?" She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Maybe later, I thought. Maybe we could go for a drive today. A drive, I chuckled. "Where to?" "Oh, just somewhere nice. I'll tell you on the way." That struck me as odd, but I didn't question it. Emily had always been spontaneous. I told her to give me a few minutes to get ready. I went upstairs, changed into my tweed jacket, and came back down to find her already tidying up the few letters and newspapers on the coffee table. "You didn't have to do that," I said, reaching for my walking stick. "I don't mind," she replied, glancing around the room like she was checking something. "You've still got that blue scarf. Might be chilly later." She fussed over my collar, then took my coat from the rack. There was a quiet urgency to her movements, as though she wanted to be on the road quickly. As I stepped outside, I paused for a moment to lock the front door, my fingers brushing over the brass key I'd carried in my pocket for decades. I didn't know then that it would be one of the last times I'd turn that key in the lock. The street was calm, lined with familiar cars, and the smell of fresh bread drifting from the corner bakery. We walked to her car, a small silver hatchback, and she opened the passenger door for me. The ride began in comfortable silence. At least, I thought it was comfortable at first. I watched Brighton fade in the side mirror, the colorful beach huts, the rows of old houses, the seafront where Margaret and I had walked hand in hand in our younger days. But as the miles slipped by, I realized Emily hadn't really told me where we were going. So, I began casually. "Are we heading toward the Downs?" She kept her eyes on the road. "Something like that. Just trust me, Grandpa." I smiled faintly, though my stomach had begun to feel uneasy. "Of course, love. I trust you. Always have." Yet something about the way she gripped the steering wheel made me think this wasn't just an afternoon drive. There was no music on the radio. The only sounds were the soft rumble of the engine and the occasional patter of rain against the windscreen. We passed familiar villages, then unfamiliar ones. The city gave way to stretches of countryside, dotted with sheep and low stone walls. My heart began to beat a little faster. "Emily," I said after a while, you're not taking me to see a doctor, are you?" She glanced at me briefly, her expression unreadable. "No, Grandpa, just somewhere safe. Somewhere you'll be looked after." I frowned. "Looked after? What on earth do you mean?" "I look after myself just fine." She said nothing. It's a strange feeling when you realize something important is happening to you, and you're the last to know exactly what it is. My grip tightened on the handle of my walking stick. I thought about all the little signs I'd ignored, the way she'd been more distant on the phone lately, the subtle questions she'd asked about my will and the house, the way she hadn't mentioned this drive until the last moment. By the time we reached a narrow lane flanked by tall hedges, I knew with a heavy certainty that this was not going to be a normal day. Emily turned into a long driveway lined with trees. At the end, I saw a large brick building with white windows and a green sign that read, "Maplewood Care Home." I looked at her, confused. "Emily, what is this?" She pulled the car to a stop and turned to face me. "Grandpa, I think this is the best place for you now. You'll have people around all the time, proper meals, no stairs to climb. You'll be safe." Safe. The word stung, as if my own home, the place where I'd built my life, loved my wife, and raised my son, had suddenly become dangerous. I felt my throat tighten. "You could have told me, love. You could have talked to me." Her eyes flickered with something, guilt, perhaps, but it passed quickly. "It's for your own good." And just like that, I realized my life had shifted in a way I couldn't undo. The comfort of routine, the warmth of familiarity, the freedom to choose all of it was slipping away, not with an accident or an illness, but with a quiet car ride on a gray Brighton morning. I didn't know then that it would only be the beginning of a story neither of us could have predicted. The car door shut with a soft but decisive click. I sat in the passenger seat, my walking stick resting between my knees, my coat folded neatly over my lap. Emily started the engine, and the hum filled the small space between us. The dashboard clock read 10:47 a.m., though I'd already lost track of time in my mind. At first, I tried to believe her words, that this was for my own good, but the more I turned them over in my head, the heavier they became. Safe, looked after. Those weren't words you used for a day trip or a surprise lunch by the seaside. Those were words you used when someone was being moved permanently. The car pulled away from the long driveway of my home street, and I caught one last glimpse of the house through the side mirror. The curtains in the living room were still half drawn, just as I'd left them that morning. The flower pots by the steps, Margaret's old geraniums, swayed slightly in the breeze. It was the view I'd seen thousands of times before, yet, in that moment, it looked strangely distant, almost like it already belonged to someone else. Emily kept her eyes on the road. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets damp and glistening in the pale light. I cleared my throat. "Emily, love, where exactly are we going?" She hesitated, just long enough for me to notice. "Somewhere in Oxfordshire. It's nice there, quiet, peaceful." I frowned slightly. "Oxfordshire, that's over an hour away." She gave a quick, tight smile. "It's not far. Not far." Funny how people twist distance when they want to make something sound harmless. For a man like me, who'd rarely traveled outside Brighton in recent years, Oxfordshire might as well have been another country. We passed the familiar shop fronts of my neighborhood, the corner bakery with its chalkboard sign, "Fresh Scones." Today, the newsagent, where I bought my paper every Sunday, the charity shop where Margaret once found a set of teacups she swore were worth a fortune. Each place felt like a friend I hadn't had the chance to say goodbye to. I tried to keep my tone light. "And what happens when we get there?" Emily shifted in her seat. "You'll meet some people, see the place. They'll explain everything better than I can." They, I asked, my voice sharpening slightly. Who's they? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned onto the main road, accelerating, just enough to make the conversation feel postponed. For the next 10 minutes, the only sounds were the wipers swishing back and forth, and the occasional growl of a lorry passing us by. I watched the scenery change, the terrace houses giving way to wider streets, then to stretches of countryside. The air inside the car felt heavy, as though words were pressing to be spoken, but refused to leave either of our mouths. I thought about saying, "Turn the car around, Emily." I thought about reminding her that I'd been managing perfectly well on my own. But there was something in her posture, the way she gripped the steering wheel, just a fraction too tightly, that told me she wouldn't. Instead, I asked softly, "Do you remember the time we drove to Eastbourne, when you were 10? Her eyes flickered toward me briefly. "Of course I do. You bought me that ridiculous straw hat. You loved that hat," I said with a small smile. "Wouldn't take it off for weeks. Even wore it in the bath once, if I recall." She laughed, a short, genuine laugh, but it faded almost instantly, swallowed up by the quiet. It was as if both of us had remembered something important. Once upon a time, these drives had been full of joy, not tension. The road narrowed as we entered a rural stretch. Hedges lined either side, tall enough to block most of the view. Every so often, a break in the greenery revealed rolling fields dotted with sheep. Normally, I'd have commented on the scenery, but my mind was elsewhere. I studied her face and profile. She looked tired, not the kind of tired that comes from lack of sleep, but the kind that settles in when you've been carrying a secret for too long. I wondered how long she'd been planning this. Weeks, months. Had she stood outside my house before, rehearsing what she'd say, or had she decided to keep the truth from me until I was already in the car, too far from home to protest? "Emily," I said finally, "if this is about money, or the house, we can talk about it. I'm not unreasonable." Her grip on the wheel tightened. "It's not about money, Grandpa." I wanted to believe her. I truly did. But her voice had that careful tone, the one people use when they're telling you only half of the truth. We stopped briefly at a small petrol station on the edge of a village I didn't recognize. She insisted I stay in the car while she went inside. From the window, I watched her walk across the forecourt, her head down, her scarf trailing slightly in the wind. For a moment, I thought about opening the door and walking away. Maybe finding a bus stop, maybe calling a taxi. But my mobile was at home, on the kitchen counter, still charging. And at my age, walking away into the unknown isn't as simple as it sounds. When she returned, she handed me a bottle of water and a packet of shortbread biscuits. "Here, thought, you might be hungry." I took them, though I had no appetite. "Thank you, love." As we drove on, the sky began to clear, and the sun broke through in soft golden patches across the fields. It should have been beautiful, but I felt no peace in it. My mind kept circling back to the same thought. She's taking me somewhere I didn't choose. The signposts changed, reading, then Abingdon, then smaller names I didn't know. The hedges gave way to broader views of countryside estates, winding rivers, and the occasional cyclist pushing up a long incline. I'd lost track of exactly how far we'd come, but my heart told me we were nowhere near Brighton anymore. Finally, after what must have been more than an hour, Emily slowed the car and turned down another narrow lane. The trees here were tall and close together, their branches meeting overhead to form a green tunnel. The sunlight filtered through and dappled patches across the road. At the end of the lane, I saw it, a large, well-kept building of red brick and white-trimmed windows. It had neatly cut lawns, flower beds bursting with color, and a painted wooden sign by the entrance that read, "Maplewood Care Home, Residential Living with Comfort and Compassion." Something inside me went cold. Emily parked the car in a small visitor's lot. She turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, her hands resting on the wheel. "This is it," she said quietly. I swallowed hard. "And what exactly is it?" She took a breath. "It's somewhere you can be comfortable. Somewhere you don't have to worry about cooking or cleaning. There's staff here all the time. You'll have your own room. People to talk to. I stared at her. Emily, I have all of that at home, except the people to talk to, but I've never minded the quiet. She reached out and touched my arm gently. Please, Grandpa, just give it a chance. Her touch was soft, but her words felt final. I could see it now. The decision had been made long before I ever stepped into her car. And as I sat there, staring at the welcoming facade of Maplewood, I realized this drive had been less about getting me here, and more about making sure I didn't have the option to turn back. The gravel crunched under the tires as Emily eased the car into a space near the entrance. For a long moment, neither of us moved. She kept her eyes fixed on the steering wheel, her fingers drumming lightly on the leather as if she were bracing herself for the next part. I looked up at the building. It was the kind of place designed to look inviting: red brick, white-trimmed windows, climbing roses along the front, but I could see past it. I'd visited enough people in residential homes to know that a well-kept garden and a fresh coat of paint didn't change what was inside. There was a smell to such places, not just a scent of disinfectant, but a deeper one, of stillness, of time slowing down, of lives packed neatly into rooms with just enough space for a bed, a chair, and a handful of personal items. Emily finally broke the silence. Let's go in, Grandpa. Her voice was soft, almost pleading. I opened the passenger door, the cool air hitting my face. The path to the entrance was lined with lavender bushes, their scent mixing with the faint smell of freshly mown grass. Somewhere nearby, a lawnmower buzzed. Inside, the air was warmer, too warm, almost stifling, and there it was, the smell, antiseptic and something faintly sweet, like talcum powder. A woman in a navy blue uniform stood behind the reception desk. She had a neat bun and a professional smile, the kind that didn't quite reach her eyes. Good morning, she said, brightly. You must be Mr. Harrison. I hesitated before answering. Yes. And this is your granddaughter, she continued, glancing at Emily. Emily nodded. This is Maplewood's manager, Mrs. Collins. Mrs. Collins came around the desk and extended her hand. Her grip was firm, practiced. We've been expecting you. Why don't I give you both a tour? Expecting me. The words sank like stones. Emily hadn't just arranged this visit. She'd scheduled it. She'd made sure they knew my name before I'd even known I was coming. I glanced at her, but she avoided my eyes. We walked down a corridor lined with framed photographs of the countryside, rolling hills, rivers, meadows in bloom. The carpet was thick, muffling the sound of our footsteps. Behind some doors, I could hear muted voices, staff chatting, a television playing an old black-and-white film. Mrs. Collins pointed out the dining hall. Round tables with crisp white tablecloths and neatly folded napkins. We serve 3 freshly prepared meals a day, plus snacks. Tea and coffee are available at all times. We passed a lounge area with large armchairs and a bookshelf full of jigsaw puzzles and paperback novels. A few residents sat there, eyes glazed, watching a midday quiz show on the television. Then came the bedrooms. She opened one door to show me an example, a small room with a single bed, a wardrobe, and a writing desk under the window. It was clean and tidy, but impersonal, the kind of place you could move into tomorrow and move out of next week without leaving a trace that you'd ever been there. I stepped inside and ran my hand over the desk. It's very neat, I said. Mrs. Collins smiled. We encourage residents to personalize their rooms with their own belongings. Photos, keepsakes, whatever makes it feel like home. Home. I thought of my armchair by the bay window in Brighton, the ticking of the old mantel clock, the faint hum of the kettle. None of that could be packed into a suitcase. When we returned to reception, Mrs. Collins handed Emily a stack of forms. We'll just need these signed when you're ready. I stared at the papers. Signed. Emily shifted uncomfortably. Just to get the process started. Process. Another word that made my chest tighten. I turned to Emily. You've already made arrangements, haven't you? She bit her lip. I've just been thinking about what's best for you, Grandpa. You've been alone for so long. Here, You'll have people to talk to, people to help if you need anything. I wanted to tell her I didn't need anything, that I was managing just fine, that I still did my own shopping, cooked my own meals, and remembered to take my pills without anyone reminding me. But looking at her, I realized this wasn't about what I needed. It was about what she wanted, or perhaps what she thought she wanted. Mrs. Collins excused herself, leaving us in the reception area. I lowered myself into one of the chairs, my walking stick resting across my knees. "Emily," I said quietly, "this isn't home. It never will be." She sat down beside me. "It could be, if you gave it a chance." I shook my head slowly. Home isn't just walls and a bed. It's the place where your memories live. And mine aren't here. For the first time that day, she looked uncertain. Her eyes flicked toward the papers in her lap, then back to me. I don't want anything to happen to you when I'm not there." I almost told her that things happen whether you're ready or not, that you can't wrap someone in cotton wool forever. But I swallowed the words. Instead, I stood up, leaning on my stick. "Let's at least have that cup of tea you promised me yesterday." She hesitated, then nodded. "There's a tea room down the road. We can talk there." As we walked back to the car, I glanced over my shoulder at the building. The brick walls glowed faintly in the sunlight, but to me, they looked cold. Not in temperature, but in spirit. I'd been inside for less than half an hour, and already I could feel it, the way places like Maplewood quietly absorb people. You arrive with your own story, your own habits, your own pace, and slowly, you're folded into their schedule, their routines, their rules. By the time we reached the car, I knew one thing for certain. If I ever set foot in Maplewood again, it would be because someone else had decided for me, and that thought chilled me more than the crisp Oxfordshire air. That first night in Maplewood, I lay in the narrow bed staring at the ceiling. The room was quiet, too quiet, the kind of stillness that doesn't soothe you, but makes every thought sound louder in your head. I could hear faint noises through the walls, the shuffle of slippers in the corridor, the hum of a vacuum cleaner somewhere far off, the muted cough of another resident. But none of it felt familiar. None of it felt like mine. The bed itself was clean and firm, but the sheets smelled of industrial laundry detergent, sharp and chemical. Nothing like the faint lavender scent Margaret used to leave on ours. I turned the pillow over, then over again, as if it might magically transform into the one from my own bedroom back in Brighton. It didn't. I thought about my house, the clock on the mantel ticking in the dark, the shadows on the walls shifting as cars passed outside, the way the pipes groaned when the heating came on. People might call those imperfections, but to me they were the sounds of a home that had grown old alongside me. Here, every sound was new, and none of it belonged to me. When Emily had left earlier that afternoon, she'd given me a hug that lasted just a little too long, like she was trying to convince both of us it was the right thing to do. "I'll visit soon," she'd said. "Just settle in. You'll see, you might even make friends here." I'd nodded, because what else could I do? But as soon as the door closed behind her, the air seemed to change. I unpacked my small suitcase, a few shirts, 2 jumpers, my shaving kit, and a framed photograph of Margaret taken on our wedding day. She was standing in front of the church, in her lace dress, her hair pinned up, smiling in that way that made her eyes almost disappear. I placed the photo on the desk by the window. At least I'd have one familiar face in the room. Dinner had been served at precisely 6 o'clock. Shepherd's pie, peas, and custard for dessert. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't mine. I'd eaten in silence at a table with 3 other men who seemed more interested in their plates than in conversation. One of them, a man called Arthur, had nodded politely at me before returning to his pudding. Afterwards, I'd wandered into the lounge, where a group of residents were watching an old sitcom. A woman in her 80s sat knitting by the fire, the clack of her needles the only sound besides the canned laughter from the television. I'd stood there for a moment, hands in my pockets, before retreating to my room. And now, lying in the dark, I couldn't stop the questions from circling in my mind. Why now? Emily had known I was managing fine on my own. I cooked, I cleaned, I paid my bills. Yes, the stairs had become a bit more of a challenge lately. But I'd adapted. I moved my bedroom downstairs and set up a little corner for reading where the sunlight came in. There had been no accidents, no emergencies. So why take me away without so much as a proper conversation? Was it the house? The thought made my chest tighten. That house was more than bricks and mortar. It was the place where Margaret and I had built our life together, where Peter had taken his first steps, where every corner told a story. But to someone else, especially someone younger, with a mortgage and bills, maybe it was just property, something to sell. I tried to push the thought away, but it returned like a tide. I pictured Emily walking through the rooms after I'd gone, opening drawers, boxing up my things, deciding what was worth keeping and what was worth donating. Would she keep Margaret's china set, the one we brought back from our honeymoon in Scotland? Or would it end up in a charity shop window, priced at £15? And what about my will? I'd written it years ago, leaving the house and most of my savings to her. At the time, it had seemed obvious she was my only grandchild, the last of my family. But now, I wondered if she saw me less as a grandfather and more as a transaction. The idea hurt more than I wanted to admit. I turned on my side, facing the window. Outside, the garden was lit by a few dim lamps, casting long shadows across the neatly trimmed hedges. I could just make out the outline of the high fence surrounding the property. That's when it struck me. This place wasn't just designed to keep residents comfortable. It was designed to keep them in. I thought of my walks along the Brighton promenade, stopping at the bakery for a fresh loaf, sitting on the bench where Margaret and I used to watch the tide. Here, even if I wanted to leave, where would I go? The road outside was narrow, bordered by fields. No shops, no buses, no familiar faces. It wasn't a home. It was a holding place. I must have dozed off at some point, because I woke to the sound of footsteps in the corridor. A nurse was doing her rounds, checking each room. She paused at my door, peering in with a polite smile before moving on. I sat up, my mind suddenly sharp. If I was going to understand why Emily had done this, I needed to pay attention. People reveal more in their actions than in their words. The next time she visited, I decided I wouldn't just let her talk. I'd watch, I'd listen, I'd ask questions she didn't expect. Because something told me this wasn't just about keeping me safe. There was something else at play. And until I knew what it was, I wasn't about to make this place my home. As the night wore on, I thought about Margaret again. I imagined her sitting at the edge of the bed, her hand resting gently on mine. She'd always had a way of seeing through people, of knowing when something wasn't quite right. "What do you think, love?" I whispered into the darkness. "Would you trust her?" Of course, there was no answer. Just the soft hum of the heating system and the faint rustle of leaves outside. Still, in my heart, I could almost hear her voice. "Keep your eyes open, Henry. Not everyone's reasons are what they seem." And so, as I finally drifted into a restless sleep, I made myself a promise. I would not let this place swallow me whole. I would find out the truth, and if there was a way back to my own home, I'd take it no matter what Emily had planned. 2 weeks had passed since Emily had left me here. 2 weeks of scheduled meals, polite conversations with strangers, and nights that seemed longer than the days. I'd begun to settle into the routine, though settle isn't the same as accept. Breakfast at 8, lunch at 12, tea at 4, dinner at 6. My life now measured in plates of food and cups of tea brought on a tray. I'd made acquaintances, not friends. Arthur, the man from my first dinner here, had warmed slightly after a few chats, though he still spoke in short sentences. Mrs. Davies, a widow in her 90s, had a fondness for telling me the same story about her wedding day, word for word, as though she were reciting it from a script. It wasn't unpleasant here, but it was. Still, everything moved at the same slow pace. You could almost feel time thickening, like syrup. And then, on a Tuesday afternoon, the stillness broke. It was just after lunch, and I was sitting in the lounge by the window, pretending to read a book I'd borrowed from the care home's small library. Outside, the sky was heavy with low gray clouds, threatening rain. That's when I saw the car pull up. It wasn't the usual family vehicle or the staff's hatchback. This was a sleek black saloon, polished, with tinted windows. A man stepped out. He was tall, in his 50s perhaps, dressed in a dark suit, despite the casual weather. He carried a slim leather briefcase and moved with the quiet confidence of someone who was used to being listened to. I thought perhaps he was here to see Mrs. Collins, the manager. But then he looked directly through the glass of the lounge window at me. Minutes later, a care assistant appeared at my elbow. "Mr. Harrison, there's a gentleman here to see you. Says his name is Mr. Whitaker." I nodded slowly, closing the book. "Send him in." Mr. Whitaker entered with a polite smile and extended his hand. "Mr. Henry Harrison, I presume." "That's me," I said, shaking it. His grip was firm, his eyes sharp but not unkind. He sat opposite me, placing the briefcase on his lap. "I hope you'll forgive the sudden visit, but this is a matter I thought best to discuss in person." I raised an eyebrow. "And what matter would that be?" He leaned forward slightly. "I'm a solicitor, based in London. I've been handling the estate of your late brother, Thomas Harrison." I blinked. Thomas. The name felt strange on my tongue. We haven't spoken in decades. Didn't even know he'd passed away. Mr. Whitaker's expression softened. "He died 6 months ago in Halifax, Nova Scotia." Halifax, Canada. The memories stirred immediately. The smell of the sea, the sound of gulls, different from those in Brighton, the wooden lodge by the bay. I hadn't been there in more than 40 years. "I'm sorry to be the bearer of difficult news," he continued. "But there is also something else you should know. Your brother left a will, and in it, he named you as his sole beneficiary." For a moment, I simply stared at him. "Beneficiary?" "Yes," he said, opening the briefcase and pulling out a folder. "He left you the entirety of his estate. This includes a sizable piece of coastal property, a fishing lodge, as well as the surrounding land, his personal savings, and a number of investments. Altogether, the value is substantial." I sat back in my chair, my mind spinning. I had no idea. "Few do. In such cases," Mr. Whitaker said calmly. "Your brother appears to have lived a quiet life in his later years, but his assets were well managed. If you wish, I can arrange a formal valuation. However, even without it, I can tell you this. Inheritance is significant." I felt an odd mixture of emotions. Sadness for Thomas. Despite our years apart, he was my brother. Regret for letting the distance grow without mending it. And shock, pure, unfiltered shock, at what I'd just been told. "How did you find me?" I asked. "Mr. Harrison, your home address in Brighton was listed in his papers. But when I went there last week, I was informed by a neighbor that you'd moved. I contacted your granddaughter, Emily, and she told me you were here." I felt my stomach drop. "She knew you were coming." "Yes," Mr. Whitaker said. "I spoke to her briefly on the phone. She seemed surprised, but she confirmed your location." I nodded slowly, but inside, the pieces began to shift. We spoke for another 20 minutes. He explained the basic legal process, documentation, probate, transfer of assets. He left his card and said he'd be in touch within the week. When he stood to leave, I walked him to the door. "Mr. Harrison," he said, pausing, "I realize this may be a great deal to take in, but I assure you, your brother's wishes were clear. He wanted you to have it all." I shook his hand again, feeling the weight of those words. All. As he walked back to the black saloon, I watched from the window until he was gone. I sat back down, staring at the solicitor's card in my hand. My pulse was steady, but my thoughts were racing. Emily had known, even if only for a few days, that this man was coming. She'd known he was bringing news that could change my life, and yet, she hadn't mentioned a word. Why was it because she thought I couldn't handle it? Or was it because she was already thinking of what it might mean for her? The more I thought about it, the more I remembered the way she'd looked at me. The day she brought me here. The quick hug, the avoidance of my eyes, the rushed explanations. A thought crossed my mind that I didn't want to believe. Maybe she was putting me somewhere safe, not for my sake, but for hers. That evening at dinner, I barely tasted the stew in front of me. Arthur asked if I was all right, but I only nodded. My mind was elsewhere, on the lodge in Halifax, the land, the money, and on the fact that, for the first time since arriving at Maplewood, I had something Emily didn't know I could use to change the rules. When I returned to my room, I placed Mr. Whitaker's card inside the frame of Margaret's photo, just behind the glass. "Looks like, my love," I whispered to her. "The game's not over yet." That night, sleep didn't come easily. The rain had started just after dinner, a steady rhythm against the window, and in the quiet darkness of my small room, I could almost imagine I was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere far from the creaking hallways of Maplewood. Somewhere the air smelled of salt and pine. Halifax, the name alone brought a flood of images, sharper than they had any right to be after so many years. I first went there in 1972. I was 33, restless, and in need of a change. Thomas had moved there 2 years earlier, chasing a job offer in the shipbuilding industry. "Come out for a few months," he'd said in a letter. "You can work with me, get a taste of something new." I'd gone expecting just that, a temporary change of scenery. But Halifax wasn't just scenery. It was a different pace of life altogether. I remember stepping off the plane and being hit by the chill. Even in early May, the air had that crisp bite to it. Thomas was there, at the arrivals gate, grinning like he'd won the lottery. "Henry, you old fool," he'd said, pulling me into a hug. "Welcome to the edge of the world." The lodge wasn't his then. It belonged to an old fisherman named Walter McLean, who rented it out for extra income. It was nothing fancy, a wooden structure with peeling paint, a single stove for heating, and a dock that jutted right into the bay. But to me, it felt like freedom. We worked together that summer, repairing holes, painting decks, hauling supplies. Thomas had a way of making hard work seem less like labor and more like an adventure. In the evenings, we'd sit on the porch with mugs of coffee, watching the fog roll in over the water. One memory stands out more than the rest. It was late August, and we'd gone out in Walter's old fishing boat before dawn. The water was like glass. The world so still it felt as though we were alone on it. "Ever think of staying here?" Thomas had asked as he adjusted the nets. "Maybe," I'd said. "But Brighton's home." He'd nodded, looking out at the horizon. "Home's where you decide to plant yourself. But sometimes the soil's better somewhere else." At the time, I'd laughed it off. But now, decades later, those words felt heavier. When Walter passed away in the late 80s, Thomas bought the lodge from his widow. By then, I'd been back in England for years, raising Emily's mother and running my small carpentry business. I'd only visited Halifax once more after that, in 1991, for Thomas's 50th birthday. He'd shown me the improvements: a new roof, insulated walls, proper heating. "This place will outlast me," he'd said proudly. And apparently, it had. I lay there in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about what the solicitor had said: a sizable piece of coastal property, surrounding land, investments. It wasn't just about money. It was about roots. Thomas had left me more than an inheritance. He'd left me a choice. For years now, I'd felt my life shrinking. First, after Margaret passed. Then, as my health slowed me down. And finally, with Emily's decision to place me here. But the lodge was the opposite of shrinking. It was space. It was air. It was mine. I found myself wondering what Emily would say if she knew the details. Would she feign excitement for me, masking the calculations running through her mind? Or would she be bold enough to tell me outright that it should be managed together, meaning, of course, by her? I hated that I even had these thoughts about my own granddaughter. But in the past 2 weeks, something had shifted between us. I couldn't unsee the way she'd avoided my eyes that day in Brighton. The rain outside grew heavier, and with it came a wave of nostalgia so strong I could almost smell the coffee brewing in Thomas's kitchen. I remembered the mornings when the fog was so thick you couldn't see the dock from the window. We'd waited out by the stove, playing cards, or talking about nothing in particular. Thomas had a laugh that filled the whole room. I remembered the evenings when the locals would come by with fresh catch, cod, mackerel, sometimes lobster. Margaret loved those visits when she came with me the second summer. She'd sit with the fishermen's wives, trading recipes and gossip, while we men pretended not to listen. And I remembered the silence. Not the empty silence of a care home corridor, but the living silence of nature, broken only by the wind, in the pines or the call of a loon across the bay. I realized then that Halifax wasn't just a memory. It was still there, waiting. Of course, there were questions. Could I make the trip at my age? Would my health allow it? Was I foolish to even think about it? But the alternative, staying here, letting my days be decided by a laminated schedule pinned to a wall, felt worse. I turned to Margaret's photo on the nightstand. "What do you think, love?" I whispered. "One last voyage." Next morning, I called Mr. Whitaker from the payphone near the reception desk. The handset smelled faintly of disinfectant, and I had to press it hard against my ear to hear him over the background clatter. "Mr. Whitaker speaking. It's Harrison," I said. "I've been thinking about what you told me. Yes, I want to know exactly what's involved in taking ownership of that lodge. All of it, the property, the land, the accounts. I want details, and I want them in writing." There was a pause. "Of course, I can prepare a full report for you, but if you're thinking about visiting the property, there will be travel arrangements to consider." "I'm aware," I said. "Just get me the papers first." As I hung up, I caught my reflection in the small square of glass above the phone. I looked older than I felt in that moment. Older, but alive. For the first time since Emily drove me away from my home, I felt like I was holding the pen again, writing my own story, instead of being a footnote in someone else's. And somewhere, across the ocean, there was a wooden lodge on a quiet bay, waiting for its rightful owner to come home. I didn't plan to confront Emily so soon. Part of me wanted to wait until I had the official papers in my hands, the solicitor's report, all neatly itemized, with no room for misunderstanding. But life has a way of setting its own stage. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon. The care home smelled faintly of boiled cabbage and bleach, as it always did on laundry day. I'd just come back from the small library nook at the end of the hall when I heard the receptionist's voice at the front desk. "Oh, Emily, good to see you again." Her name hit me before her face did, and there she was, standing in the doorway, rain still glistening on her coat. She wasn't carrying flowers or a tin of biscuits this time, just her handbag, and that slight look of polite urgency she wore when she thought she had somewhere better to be. "Granddad," she said, walking towards me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I was in the area for a client meeting and thought I'd drop by. A lie. She lived 30 miles from here, and her work didn't take her anywhere near Maplewood. I gestured to the bench near the reception. "Sit with me for a minute." We made small talk at first. She asked about my hip, still giving you trouble, and I told her the staff had been kind. She glanced at her watch twice. Finally, I decided to stop circling the runway. "Emily," I said, leaning forward, "I had a visitor earlier this week, a solicitor from Halifax, name of Whitaker." Her smile flickered, just for a moment. "Halifax, as in Canada." "That's the one. I don't think I know anyone there." "You don't," I said, "but my late friend Thomas lived there for decades. He passed away in January, left me a lodge by the coast, surrounding land, investments." She blinked, then laughed softly, like I'd told a quaint story. "That's unexpected." "It is," I agreed, especially since I hadn't heard from Thomas in years. "But it's mine now, all of it." I watched her face carefully. Emily was good at keeping her expressions neutral, a skill she'd picked up from her father, no doubt. But there was a flicker there, a calculation. "That's wonderful, Granddad," she said finally. "I'm sure we can figure out the best way to manage it. Maybe sell it and I'm not selling it." My voice was sharper than I intended. "I'm going there. To Halifax." Her head tilted. "You mean to visit?" "To live," I said. "I'm claiming it. moving in. There was a silence between us then, thick enough to feel. Emily looked at me like I'd just told her I was planning to climb Mount Everest. "Granddad, you're 81. You can't just uproot yourself, and I can, and I will. You brought me here without asking me, remember? Packed up my life into cardboard boxes while I was at my doctor's appointment. I woke up one morning in my own bed and went to sleep that night in a care home room. That wasn't my choice." Her mouth opened, then closed. "I did it for your own good," she said finally. "You were living alone, forgetting to take your medication. I was living," I cut in, "something I haven't been doing much of here." She crossed her arms. "So what happens when you get to Halifax? Who's going to look after you? Who's going to make sure you're eating properly, taking your pills, not slipping on ice in the winter?" "I'll manage. I'll hire help if I need it, but it'll be my choice." Her voice softened, but the steel was still there. "You're making a mistake. That property could be worth a lot if sold. The money could give you more security here, better care." "I don't need better care," I said. "I need my life back." She sighed, looking away towards the window. "You've always been stubborn, and you've always thought you know better than everyone else," I said, not unkindly. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Rain traced thin lines down the glass, and I thought about the Atlantic, wider than any rift between us, but just as cold when you're caught in it. "Granddad," she said after a long pause, "if you go through with this, I can't promise. I'll be there to help when things get difficult." I nodded. "I know, and I'm not asking you to." Her jaw tightened, but she didn't argue. The receptionist called out then, saying something about a package that had arrived for me. The moment broke. Emily stood, smoothing the front of her coat. "I should go. I'll let you know when I have my ticket booked," I said. She hesitated. "You really doing this?" "Yes." She gave a short nod, turned, and walked out into the rain without looking back. That night, lying in bed, I felt a strange mix of emotions. There was relief I'd said what needed saying, but also a hollow ache. Emily and I had always been close, especially after her father passed. I'd been there for her first day of school, her graduation, the birth of her son. But somewhere along the way, she'd started thinking of me as a responsibility to be managed, rather than a man with a say in his own life. Maybe Halifax would change that. Maybe distance would help her see me differently. Or maybe it would simply be the final chapter of whatever bond we still had. The next morning, the package turned out to be the first set of documents from Mr. Whitaker. Maps of the property, photographs of the lodge, an inventory of the contents. I sat at the small desk by the window, spreading them out like treasure. Maps. The photos showed the place exactly as I remembered. Wooden siding, green trim, a dock stretching out over calm blue water. In one picture, the porch chairs were still there. I half expected to see Thomas sitting in one of them. That evening, I wrote my reply to Mr. Whitaker, giving him my formal acceptance of the inheritance and asking him to begin the process of transferring ownership. I told him I'd need help arranging the move, but that I was determined to be there before the first snowfall. As I sealed the envelope, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. The air smelled different the moment I stepped out of Halifax Stanfield International Airport. It was sharp, salted, with a whisper of pine carried on the breeze. The kind of air that made your lungs feel as though they'd just been scrubbed clean. I tightened my scarf. The wind here had a bite even in early October and gripped the handle of my single suitcase. One suitcase. That's all I'd brought. Everything else that mattered was already here, waiting for me, in the lodge Thomas had left behind. The taxi ride from the airport took nearly an hour. The driver, a friendly fellow named Derek, talked about the tourist season winding down, the lobster boats heading in, and the way the first frost could sneak in before Halloween if you weren't careful. I half listened, half stared out the window. The landscape was all rolling hills, golden fields, and pockets of forest already turning to flame-colored leaves. And then the ocean appeared, sudden and vast, a steel blue sheet stretching to the edge of sight. It had been decades since I'd seen it last. When the taxi finally turned onto the gravel lane leading to the lodge, my chest tightened. There it was, the same sloping roof, the same green trim, the same porch where Thomas and I had spent countless evenings with mugs of tea, watching the sun sink into the water. I could almost hear his voice, low and steady. Life's not about how many years you get, old friend. It's about how many you actually live. The place looked well kept. Someone had been maintaining it. Mr. Whitaker had mentioned hiring a caretaker, a man named Cal, who lived half a mile down the road. I paid Derek, thanked him, and stood for a long moment, just staring at the building. Then I climbed the porch steps. The boards creaked under my weight in the same familiar way. The key turned smoothly in the lock. The door swung open. Inside, it was like stepping back in time. The air was faintly scented with cedar. The living room still had the leather armchair I used to sit in. The shelves still lined with Thomas's old books, titles on history, maritime lore, and a few dog-eared detective novels. On the mantel was a framed photo of the two of us, taken in the summer of '79, both of us grinning like fools with fishing rods in hand. I stood there for a long time, letting the memories wash over me. The first night, I slept with the window cracked open, the sound of the waves carrying into the room. I'd forgotten how the ocean has its own rhythm, a slow, steady heartbeat that seeps into your bones. The next morning, Cal came by, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 60s. He had the kind of handshake that made you believe he'd once been able to bend nails with his bare hands. "Welcome home," he said, simply. We had coffee at the kitchen table, and I learned he'd been keeping the place in shape for years, ever since Thomas's health had started failing. He knew the quirks of the lodge, which window stuck in the winter, how to coax the old wood stove into life, and which pantry shelf the mice favored if you didn't keep it sealed. It felt good, having someone nearby who understood the place better than I did. Over the next week, I began settling in. My days took on a rhythm. Mornings spent on the porch with coffee, afternoons walking the rocky shoreline, evenings reading by the fire. The sea became my clock. I woke with the gulls, rested when the tide turned, and let the setting sun decide when it was time to put down my book. I thought often about Emily. She'd called once since I arrived. The conversation had been polite, if strained. "How's the new place?" she'd asked. "Peaceful," I'd said. "And the air's clean enough to make you believe you've been breathing wrong your whole life." She'd laughed, but it was a short, careful laugh. We didn't talk about the care home, or the move, or the way she'd left that day in the rain. Part of me hoped she'd visit. Another part knew she might never set foot here. One afternoon, while going through some of Thomas's old belongings, I found a letter addressed to me. The handwriting was shaky, but unmistakable. "If you're reading this, old friend, it means I've gone, and you've found your way back here. I hope this place gives you what it gave me, space to breathe, time to think, and the courage to live exactly as you please. We never get as much time as we think we will. Don't waste a bit you've got left trying to please anyone else." I read it twice, then folded it carefully and put it in my jacket pocket. It felt like Thomas was still here, urging me on. The locals were kind, if a little cautious at first. I was the man from England to most of them, though that wasn't quite true anymore. Down at the general store, a woman named Margaret insisted I try her homemade blueberry muffins. At the dock, an old fisherman named Joe invited me onto his boat one chilly morning, teaching me how to check the lobster pots. I found myself smiling more, talking more, even laughing in ways I hadn't for years. Winter came sooner than I expected. The first snowfall dusted the roof in late November, and by December the bay had begun to freeze along the edges. I stocked the pantry, kept the woodpile high, and learned to appreciate the hush that came when the world outside was blanketed in white. Some nights, sitting by the fire, I'd think about the care home, the fluorescent lights, the faint smell of disinfectant, the schedule that had sliced each day into the same bland portions, and I'd realize just how far I'd come. Christmas was quiet, but not lonely. Cal brought over a bottle of rum, and we sat swapping stories until well past midnight. I called Emily, wished her and her family well. She sounded genuinely pleased to hear from me, though I could still feel that invisible wall between us. Maybe, in time, it would come down. Maybe not. But either way, I was where I needed to be. By spring, I'd taken to keeping a small garden, out back, lettuce, tomatoes, a few stubborn herbs that didn't mind the salt air. My knees complained, but the work felt good. The sea had a way of keeping me honest. Out here, there was no hiding behind excuses, no pretending you were too busy to live. One morning in May, I stood on the dock, watching the sunrise turn the water to molten gold. And I thought of Thomas's words again. Life's not about how many years you get. It's about how many you actually live. For the first time in years, I knew exactly what he meant. I never thought being taken from my home would lead me here. I never thought losing my say in life would push me to reclaim it so fiercely. Emily might still believe she was right to put me in that care home. Maybe, in her mind, she saved me from something. But what I know is this. She also set in motion the very chain of events that gave me this second chapter. And for that, though she never quite understand, I'm grateful. As I write this, the tide is going out. There's a pot of tea on the stove. The gulls are calling overhead, and the air smells like salt and promise. I am an old man by any sensible measure. But here, on this edge of the Atlantic, in the lodge of an old friend who believed in living fully, I feel younger than I have in decades. And for whatever time I have left, this is where I will be, living